There's my convenient cue to start there. Well, I was going to wait for it to go. I've been interrupted by it so many times getting ahead of myself here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Benjamin Ely. I'm the Executive Director of the Berks History Center. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here to our auditorium for our second Saturday program. I just have a few announcements I want to cover here before we get started with our program here. First off, if you are not a member, we have someone standing by in the line who can fix that for you, and your life will improve dramatically. Okay, we have a great quarterly magazine, the Historical Review of Berks County. It's been continuous publication since 1935. It's an outstanding magazine. It is one of the perks of membership. And of course, we have programs here at the museum. We have our wonderful research library next door, and programs that we do all around the county that take part of. There's lots of activities, so if you haven't joined, we hope you might consider it. We'd love to have you among our ranks here. But thank you all for coming. We have a new exhibit here, if you weren't aware. It's in our Homer Gallery. It is the photography of Dr. William A. Heyman. It's a wonderful new exhibit. It's the first exhibit we've been able to open here in a couple of years now. So we're very excited about that. So please take a look at it. And if you haven't been through the museum in a while, take a stroll through the museum and enjoy it. We'd love to see you roaming through the galleries here. Some of the programs we have coming up here on April 30th from 10 to 1, we have a walk the Spainsville Loop with historian Michelle Lynch. And she's going to be doing a moderate 3+ mile walk along Spainsville Road and Oley. And Michelle's a walking textbook for our local history here. It's great to spend some time with her. I think you'd really enjoy that if you're up for the 3-mile walk. We have our Brunch and Brushes program. We don't make anybody walk on our Brunch and Brushes program. It's a painting program. And our curator, Amber Smith, she walks people through. She has a few different designs that she swaps out to do some PA German art. So inspired by a historic painting, she kind of walks you through how to do that. And even if you don't think you have skills as a painter, in Amber's hands, you are going to paint a masterpiece. And you're going to feel great and get snacks. So we've got a couple of those coming up here. May 7th, we have one that starts in the morning from 10 to 1. And on May 12th, we have one in the evening from 5 to 8. On May 14th, we have our next second Saturday program coming up. And it's going to be titled, Before He Was a Catcher or a Spy, Mo Berg's Year with the 1925 Reading Keys. One of our trustees, longtime members, Brian Engelhardt, is a sports historian, and he'll do the program. And this gentleman, Mo Berg, has a very interesting history, even outside of baseball, with espionage activity with the Office of Secret Service, which is the predecessor to the CIA. And on May 22nd, we got another Ole Valley barn tour coming up. And those tours are always selecting different barns. So if you've been on an earlier barn tour with Greg Huber, come back and join us again, because there's going to be a different set for you, something new for you to see always on those tours. And then we have bus tours going. So we got another big bus tour. It's a multi-day tour with White Star Tours bus. And we are going to Saratoga Springs. And so some of the highlights here, we're going to the Great Appalachian Valley, exploring the Lake George area. Lake George, Saratoga Springs, Fort Ticonderoga, Lake Placid, and the Prospect Mountains. So we can get you more information about all of that here before you leave if you're interested. Or you go to our website, berkshistory.org. You can follow us on social media if you're so inclined. We live on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'd be happy to have you as a new follower there. And we're always loading up new content, not only just announcing programs, but bits of history, things from the collection, neat things that come up in between programs that we want to share with everybody. So we're always putting new things there. But we're here for the main event. With us here, Mr. Carl Bloss, who is the Archivist Emeritus at the Bethany Children's Home. And he's here to talk about the early orphanages of Berks and Reading for us. And I hope you'll please help me welcome Mr. Carl Bloss.
Thank you, Ben. We'll try to get around the logistics of all the slides and stuff in order here. I'm more a visual person, so it's arranged around the pictures and the words just accompany the flow a little bit. During my last presentation of the Soldiers Orphan School program, which is also streamed through Berks County and Bethany, it was alluded that there were many orphanages in Berks and Reading. Very few people know anything about them. Individuals come to me and say, well, they know about this one, they know about that, but nowhere is it written down very much information about them. Many of these were formed in the late 1870s, 1880s, after the Civil War, but only 2 of them remain. One is across the street, the Children's Home of Reading, and the other one is Bethany Children's Home in Womelsdorf. By the 1900s, there were specific sightings of the orphanages, and that was the clue for me. Where do I go? How do I find the information so that I can put it in some kind of narrative for you to understand? Now, if I can try to get this stuff going the way I want it. To begin with, I want to... Oops, wrong button. Wrong button, yeah. I have to know if I'm going left or right, okay? I guess I'm not the old movies. I like to talk about where I got my sources and information to begin with. So in case if you leave early, you at least have this information so you know what's been going on. I have the site. It's been very difficult to put this stuff together with COVID and not being able to get out and do the physical research in some of the locations that I wanted to do. But I have to cite certain sources right off the bat. First one is this one called Reading and Berks by Joseph Webb. This is a good site where I got information, especially about the Catholic orphanages in Reading. He has more information on that site that you must go and you can read page after page as well as pictures. Some of this information is included in this one. The other ones that we have to talk about here are, of course, Berks History Center. Information from here, since this relates specifically to Berks and Reading, we've done a lot of work. The Genealogical Society, the Reading Eagle, Montgomery's History of Berks County, one of the first places to cite and name these orphanages. Arcadia, which is a book company that has postcard pictures and time of old living in whatever community that you were talking about. Reading Eagle photo books have a collection in here. Pennsylvania State Archives, and I cannot forget my friend George Meiser and Gloria, because their passing scene books have a lot of photos of the time period. It's just that in his book you got to look through all of them or hunt through the index to find the specific items that you want. But this is more visual rather than narrative that we have at this particular point. Orphanages were made sensationalized, if you want to, through things like Dickens' stories. You know the story of Oliver Twist, and Dickens was a reformer in England trying to make known what it was like to be poor at that time. Even going back to Scrooge, you can see how the attitudes and the people were at that time. And then you have the story of Annie, which has been sensationalized as to how Daddy Warbucks, the rich man, adopts the poor kid and tries to make life better. And these stories leave a lot to be desired as to how you are describing what orphanages were at that time. So, what constitutes an orphanage? A child whose both parents are dead. This is a full orphan. That's really what an orphan is. It's an orphan who has no parents, no one to take care of them. By law, this was called a double orphan. If one parent died, you're considered a half orphan. If the mother is deceased, the offspring often are considered an orphan regardless of the father's position. And another one which I added to the end through the help of my archivist is that if the father is deceased, they were called fatherless. And that's the expression through the soldiers' orphan schools. And when you hear of most of the orphanages is fatherless because it came after the Civil War. The mother was often considered not able to care for the child. Until the 1900s, mothers just said, I think we can take care of it, we'll try it anyway. So there were still families that could not take care of them. So we moved from that point to what is an orphanage. Historically, an orphanage is a residential institution or a group home that cares for orphans or other children separated from their biological families. These children could have been placed in the institutions either with both parents deceased. For the time that I remember at Bethany, there was only 1 or 2 families that were both parents were deceased. In most cases, it came. A lot of it got developed back in the Civil War that the soldiers didn't come back. And that's where the soldiers' orphan school program got started, where the state began. We'll come into that a little bit later as we come in here. But there were many reasons for having an orphanage. There were no places to care for children, and often they were abandoned and left to manage on their own. If you had well-to-do and you had money, you could either have a governess, a teacher, or a nanny, or the children could be sent off to a private school. Even some of these private schools and colleges are not what they were originally named as. The less fortunate often got caught up in the struggle. Quite often, children whose families could not care for themselves were placed with relatives or neighbors. This was the old-fashioned way. The community takes care of its own. They brought them in and took care of them, sometimes even at their own expense. It was very, very difficult to manage this. But more and more, it ended up with the courts making decisions about where children who had no one to take care of them would be placed. And this brought about some of the changes that we will discuss in this particular one. With the explosion of the immigrants coming to America, there were many children that got lost in the shuffle between pandemics like COVID. Back then it was the flu or diphtheria or typhoid or something like that. Poverty, struggles with drug and alcohol addiction. There were many things. But probably the worst of all were wars. Wars were the devastation where especially fathers went off to fight, never came back. And someone needed to take care of them. Sometimes the government tried to help out with pensions after the wars to help widows. And there were local groups that would work with some of these that we could work with. But this one is a place that, an orphanage is a place that is willing to take care of these places. It is no longer a term that's used. They don't use that word orphanage as such anymore. They are called children's homes or residential treatment or residential homes that they have. Sometimes the images of the past deflect and oftentimes will give you a negative view of what it was like to live in an orphanage. We had a meeting at Bethany yesterday where we were talking about how fortunate we really were to be living in an orphanage, because in many ways we were living better than if you were being raised by your own family at home. And this is through the care of the institution that took care of you. But these images of the past allude back to the time of the workhouse. This was a system that began in England way back in Dickens' time. It eventually turned into what was called the alms house or the poorhouse. These terms ring a bell to you? We had to come up with these. The Children's Aid Society tried to work a lot of this one out, and even in the city of Philadelphia, the Children's Aid Society couldn't take care of all of the children, so they would load them up on trains. And guess where they would take them to? Out west. And out west they would describe it as auction them off, auction these children. Some of them were accepted in a normal situation where the family really wanted the love and care of someone else being in the family. Others were just looking for a workforce. And how else can you get a better workforce than is to adopt or bring someone in from outside to take care of them? We'll come into this one in a few minutes here. It also is placing out to other places, has brought out about the term, and we'll bring this one up again, about indenturing. Indenturing is a mode of placing a person or child out for a period of time to do a particular job or to move on with life. The history of the orphanage or the child care system could take books to record. The first placements with children were neighbors. Children's Aid Society attempted through the Orphans train concept, but most were funded through a church or private donations. By the turn of the 20th century, reformers began questioning the value of group institutions and laying the groundwork for a more modern child welfare system in which the government and public social services were on the rise. And this led to what we call adoptions or foster care. I need my helper here, okay? Sometimes I know the word, takes seconds for it to come right out. All of this one is involved in the The history of child care talks here that after the Civil War, states began to fund a way to take care of orphans. Pennsylvania agreed earlier on that we'll take care of you. Go fight the war first and we'll take care of your children when they come back. Well, the state finally, in about 1865, set up a system of schools around Pennsylvania to take care of orphans. It was described in my previous program, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this one. But this foster care and adoption was the eventual movement. Institutions continued to grow, but it fell out of favor in the early 1900s, and by the 1920s, 1930s, it was starting to slow down. The history continues today that the rise of children's homes, residential treatment homes, group care facilities resulted in name changes. They no longer can call us orphanages because we didn't just work to take care of orphans. We took care of other children for other needs as the situation evolved. All institutions, in order to grow and keep going, have to accept changes in time and what the public and people will do on this one. But it's still needed to address the substitute families, surrogate families, The modern foster care and adoptions are replacing the traditional orphanage. So all we could talk about now are the past, or the remnants of the past that we have. Under the orphanage system that was developed by the state, there were two levels. One was called primary care, and these are for children who near birth or age 6 up to about 7 or 8. And then after that, it was called a secondary school, where they kept the children until they became of age. In the Civil War time, of being of age was about 16 years old. Why? That's when they were marrying off the girls. Girls were getting married as early as 16. Some even married earlier than that. Much different as time goes on, isn't it? The way you can see this one happen. There were no secondary schools in Berks County. In fact, there were no soldiers' orphan schools except Bethany Children's Home. We started as a part of the program because we accepted Civil War children. However, we came to terms with the state that since we were a church-related situation, that we couldn't abide by the state's rules. So Bethany broke away from the system, but the system continued until about early 1900s, just about that, 1890, 1900, when it finally dissolved due to a lot of scandals that were involved in the system. We'll come into some of that one a little bit later. I bring it up now because Berks County didn't have any schools other than Bethany. Bethany just became a funnel in place. Bring them here, we'll evaluate them, and send them to other schools. Most of them went to Chester Springs in Lancaster County, is the nearest one that we had. Bethany did serve 129 orphans during this period of time. We still tend to look back at the larger homes in Pennsylvania that you might recognize or be aware of the names. Most of you know about Girard College in Philadelphia. This is a private institution that was designed strictly for poor white boys. And it took until Brown versus Board of Education in 1957 for this to change. Even to segregate, it was for poor white boys. Okay? Now, we move to the other one. Oh, by the way, Girard was founded about 1844. So that's before the Civil War. Therefore, he left the money for something specific. Hershey School didn't get started until 1909. So that's a little later time frame. But even Hershey School did not accept girls to begin with. It was a boys' school, and it wasn't until much later where you had to desegregate as well as integrate everything that girls were accepted and are brought into the school, even as Girard did today. The only two that remain in Berks County right now is Bethany Children's Home, and from across the street, the Children's Home of Reading, often called CORS, as you will find. These are the two institutions. It doesn't mean that smaller groups are not cared for in other places, and we'll talk to those later in the presentation. But we have to move on as to how did the orphanage progress and move ahead here. I'm sorry, sometimes coordinate the two here. Doesn't want to. My own slide presentation doesn't want to advance me. and they just have to look around. I'm sorry, my own computer is acting up on me. There it is. Okay, I'm sorry. We come first to the almshouse. We bring this one up because it started in England when they needed to take care of so many poor kids running like urchins through the streets, get them off the streets, give them something to do, a place to work, even to live. And the almshouse was run by money that was donated by the public to take care of these indigent people. But before the Civil War, they had to be registered and kept track of in all of the times. So the rural alms school just developed over time. It was just plain poorhouse is the way you could say it. Boards were formed, institutions built around it, so it was still an institution that was taking care of children. Every county in Pennsylvania had an almshouse. They just didn't want to call it the poorhouse, but I can still remember in the records that that's what they called it. They later just modified the term to almshouse. So Berks County had its own almshouse. It was created in 1823, but it was known to begin with as the poorhouse. So you can see how it evolved. This is a photograph of what it looks like. It almost looks like part of this photograph that's up here. Can you see it up there? That's what it looks like. They bought up 417 acres in Cumru Township, and it was opened by Governor Mifflin, and you know where Governor Mifflin is around here, so you have an idea as to where we're talking about in this one. John Updike used it as a part of his presentation of what a poorhouse was like. Some other photographs showing the almshouse. It stood on 514 acres of land, 434 was under cultivation. It was like a farm, and it had a lot of gardens, but the complex housed an almshouse, hospital for the infirm, and also an insane asylum. So what the county was trying to take care of here were all forms of indigent people lobbed into one area. As we said before, it was established in 1824, and it had both a male and female department that was included in this one. The female hospital was erected in 1832. 1850 house, they kept adding on and kept adding on. They put the hospital there about 1872, time frame right after the Civil War. And here they took care of sick, disabled, and the feeble-minded until they ran out, and they kept getting bigger and bigger. By 1885, it grew so large that there were 86 people there. Now, to us, 86 is nothing. You know, it's a number about half. This is about half that size already here. And many of them would be better served if they were transferred to the Harrisburg State Hospital, or the Danville State Hospital is where they started when they were sort of deciding what to do with the almshouse. Now, I must relate something from Bethany, because back in 1883, when Berks County was trying to hunker down and close up the almshouse, Bethany was asked to take the children, but there were 40-some children that needed to be taken care of. Bethany said no. And they said no because Bethany was founded as a church organization, and founded specifically for members of the German Reformed Church. Of these 40, about half of them were of the Reformed Church, and they were told in turn that you need to reapply directly to Bethany. If you reapplied and you met the standards for Bethany, you would be brought into the system at that particular point. Everything seemed to peak here about this 1878, and by 1932, they were ready to shut the place down. This eventually was changed when they moved to Bern Township, actually moving up towards Leesport, and the whole structure of Berks County up there with the prison and a place called Berksheim. Today, Berksheim is mostly for older people in Berks County. It does not house children other than up in that facility where they've been housing some of the refugees that are being distributed and moved around that you hear about in the news. It closed in this time. This is what we remember it by today. They do have a small museum. You can see some of the things that were happening at this particular time. And the old almshouse was then demolished, replaced by apartment buildings, private homes, the shopping center at Kenhorst. Are you with me? You know what I'm talking about? The big Redner's in there. Across the street is Aldi's. And that whole area was all part of the almshouse. So you can focus in on an area, you know what I'm talking about as we get through here. And of course, it covers the Governor Mifflin schools. That was all land that was part of this one. 417 acres, it was a big one. Many of the county almshouse records still exist in the Pennsylvania archives. So if you knew of anybody back at that time, you might have said, would they have been in the almshouse? You can check through the state archives. It's one of the main sources. I do not know if Berks County has any of these records yet or not. I haven't explored it far enough. Orphanages didn't really get started in America on a widespread form until the Civil War. It created a massive need for care for children. The helps that were offered at that particular time were, in the picture on the left is the Widows Society taking care of the mothers. That came back. The other picture is a cartoon like a David Nass photograph saying, go to war, we'll take care of your children and the wives that are left over. Sounds familiar in war times. This was a map that I had recreated for my program of the Soldiers Orphan School program. You can see statewide where most of the soldiers' orphan schools were founded. Everyone is numbered in the presentation I have, all of them that are listed there. But if you look for where Berks County is, there's only one number in there, and it says 33. That would have been Bethany Children's Home. But we didn't stay there very long. You can see in Chester County and Lancaster County below it that there are more of the homes. But there were more than 40 around the state. There are only about 3. For a long time I thought we were the only, Bethany, by the way, I have to talk from Bethany perspective. Bethany was the only remaining institution. But we find out that the children's home in Lancaster was a part of that. It doesn't maintain the institutional mode as we did, and the Children's Home of York also was a member of the Soldiers Orphan School program. All of the others have closed up. The last one just closed in 2009, and that was the state school for all military people. This shows you a little bit that Berks County did have orphans. They applied to the state to be admitted to the Soldiers Orphan School program, but they were funneled off to another area where they had them. We didn't have one at the time. So there is a way that we can track back to the children from Berks County, but you have to go through every single yearly book to find out who came from Berks County. They are not registered in one location. Another time, another investigation. Just try to put those names together. So how did things move ahead? From city to country, this is where the orphan school, they would advertise in newspapers, homes wanted for children. Now, you'd think that that sounds altruistic, and it is, in that you would take care of children. But it wasn't the reason why everybody accepted people this way. And it is defined, there are books written about the orphan train, about how the children lost their identities, not knowing where they were. Part of what drives me is that every child has a name, and they deserve to know about it. So I get involved in teaching genealogy, as well as finding about orphans, as well as adoptees. So I've done a lot of work in DNA, and have brought a lot of families together that were searching their DNA biological families. Not that they want to learn or know anything, they just want to know, where did that come from? And they deserve a right to know about that, but our adoption rules freeze the records, and you can't get it. Even for my brother's own daughter, I couldn't get them. They just released the records in New Jersey up to 1929, but not anything after that yet. It's almost like census records being frozen in place until all the possible people are dead. And then you can find out where they came from. But it takes a long time to be able to go through that. One of the heart-wrenching stories that we have about the time period here happens to be this one called The Orphan's Tale. You might try to get it from the library sometime to read it. It's a heart-wrenching kind of story that tells you from an orphan's point of view what it was like. It wasn't always glory, it wasn't always good. Yesterday we had a meeting where we had a good time just talking about what was it like? What were our blessings? Where did we come from on these? These stories retell the improbable lives of what we call orphans today. And you're called orphans because that's where you were put in. In the census, do you know how they listed us? How?
I was saying all inmates.
They call us inmates. Because people who lived in institutions, I don't care if it was a prison or an insane asylum, if you lived in an institution, you were considered an inmate. Now that eventually changed when they called us residents. Okay, little better term, you reside there. But the terminologies over time leave such wonder in your mind as to how you would describe and explain what the experiences are like from one generation to another. I don't know what the youngest generation is here. I don't see anyone too very, very, very young. But Jennifer, yes. By the way, may I introduce you to Jennifer? Jennifer Clark is the archivist at Bethany Children's Home. Okay. So let's go look a little bit further. How did I get information about these orphanages? It came about through the census. There used to be a charitable census that was listed. And it made a list of all of these orphanages that I found in different sources. Morton's history told me a lot. So you pick up the names and the pieces here, a piece there, and some people, if you know one that I missed, don't be afraid to tell me. I'm not saying that this is a conclusive list, but let's try to list them, and we'll go one by one. From the oldest known to where we stand at present, okay? We have to list very first of all here. Yeah, here we are, okay. Number one is Bethany, okay? I talk about Bethany so much because in 2 weeks, it would have been 83 years ago that I was admitted to Bethany as an inmate. They even got my name spelled wrong. I didn't learn until I was about 13 that I was named for my father. I was a junior. There are so many things about your lives, and what has brought me back here is I wanted to know more about myself. So I came back to the only real home that I know of. My mother survived, but it's not quite the same. When you see your mother once a year, it doesn't develop a very loving kind of relationship. You can see how it is. Even though they care for you, if they're not there, this is just the way things work. To get started here, Bethany Children's Home was founded in 1863 in Philadelphia by Reverend Emanuel Berringer. It removed from Philadelphia to Bridesburg a couple of years later, and due to the death of the founders, they eventually moved to Womelsdorf in 1867. We have artists drawing here of Bridesburg School, and the other picture is a more recent photograph in the 1900s. We know it's the same place by the shutters. They just added things on both sides, changed the road, and a few other things. We've been back there so we could visit the place. We know what it was like a long time ago, is the way things were. This is one of the original photographs that we have of the Manderbox Springs Resort. Now, many of you know that Paul Miller talks a lot about the resorts, the spring resorts in Wintersville area. We're on that same mountain, but down much further. Henry Manderbox started a resort there back in the 1860s, and Bethany bought it, and we moved lock, stock, and barrel there in 1867. This building burned down in 1881 with all of the records. So everything after that had to be recreated from scratch. And a lot of the display and items that we have up front talk about how we have tried to recover the history of the past of our place and how we get through this one. See where I am. By the way, its original name was called the Shepherd of the Lambs, which was named for a church Sunday school newspaper. It grew so fast that at its height, Bethany was caring for more than 285 children at one time. In the 1950 census, I was listed there at age 15. There were about 213 kids on campus at that particular time. So you can see how big the institution was. There was a time in our early history that it was proposed to close us up and combine us with another orphanage. It was decided no, that this one serves the local people. It was founded by the German Reformed Church, and part of its original charter indicated that we were to serve children that came out of the church situation. So you could say, was it segregated? Yes, in a way, because it defined who was accepted. Later, when the courts took over, the courts were deciding where to place children. We were told by the welfare state that we had to do it, as they were deinstitutionalizing. Therefore, we lost our church backing because we now became wards of the state. As I say, we talked about this vested interest. Maybe another time, we have a PowerPoint on Bethany. Maybe another time we could do a special presentation just about Bethany. But it has provided, up to this point, in 159 years, it has served over 12,000 children. So you can see the importance that we have here. This picture on the left is the buildings that I knew of. That's been torn down. That was the old administration and Santee. Many of you living in this area might have come for our fabulous summer anniversaries, because people came from far and wide to come to those events for band concerts and everything else that we used to have. It also gave us a good time to mingle. And the other one is the current picture that we have. We remember things from the past through our histories and through the stories that children write about. This one here, 5 of us, a handful, was a member, was at Bethany while I was there. She talks about one member of her family being adopted and how for so long they couldn't find him until he came back to Bethany and they re-met again. It's these kind of stories that keep us moving. So let's move to the next orphanage then. Called St. Catherine's. St. Catherine's was a Roman Catholic institution named for Mrs. Catherine Mabry, a widow who died in 1871. She left her properties to the Archbishop Wood Diocese, and it was opened in 1872 under the supervision of the 3 charities, Sisters of Charities, at 1026 Franklin Street. Anyone living near there? Do you know where it is? Okay. And it was for girls 2 to 10. And they kept them there until they were 14 years of age. After 14, they were either indentured out or went out on their very own. As of 1909, it had 90 children in it, but it closed in 1965, and the building that was there was razed. Let me move ahead there. A couple more pictures here. This is the older building. They moved a lot of the stuff to the Archdiocese, which held in Allentown at that time. So this was called St. Catherine's. Second oldest one would be our next door neighbor. Only back then it was called the Home for the Friendlist. It began as a nursery for women on Franklin Street in 1884. But it outgrew that. This was daycare, almost like a daycare is the way it got started. But then they started accepting children. And as they outgrew it, they moved their home in 1888 eventually changed their name from Home for Friendless Children to the Children's Home of Reading when they moved up here to Center Avenue in 1947. It is still in operation. It is a residential children's home, very similar to Bethany, is the way that they do the works that they have today. Take some time and just go across the street and visit them sometime. They're here for you. This is a picture of it today, the way it looks like. Name changes, they had to change their names. Children's Home as opposed to Orphanages, Home for the Friendless, things like that. Things have changed over the time. Now, one other thing that we have is there were other homes that were called Homes for the Friendless. The largest one was up in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre area. They were named for the fatherless after the Civil War. They became almost a private institution funded by the county or the location where they were particularly living in. They were originally only planned for temporary shelter, not for anything more permanent. But they just found that they had to care for more people as they were moving on. This is more what it looks like from the front today. And someone from their school has also written a history of what life was like. I'm not sure there was somebody who came and asked me a question or told me about somebody from the children's home. Is that person here? No, okay. I guess it was yesterday. So the next one on our agenda is called the House of the Good Shepherd. A lot of these have Christian names because that's how most of them were started. This was founded, I thought I had it right there in front of me. No. Founded by the Catholic Church in 1889, 4th and Pine, called Marymount on the Schuylkill. Some of you might remember this. We'll show pictures. It looks like a mansion, and it basically was. It no longer exists. It was torn down in the 1970s. And these are some other photographs of what it looked like. Some of these came from the Miser book and the postcard series. It looks like a big castle up on the hill. Had a grand entrance with a place like this. There isn't too much that is known about it. I would say that the Mr. Webb has written more about this on his site, that you could learn more about what was going on. This Good Shepherd home, nope, I don't have it here. Let me see. I'm sorry. A lot of the Catholic institutions were founded under the rector of St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church in Reading. His name was Father Borneman. The name may come up because every time that you talk about the orphanages in Bethany or in Reading, Berks area, his name comes up so often that because he was the head of the diocese, he was responsible for seeing how it would be run. They usually got ladies, they were the Sisters of Charity or other groups like that to run the institution. They were run mostly by the Catholic Church until they could no longer continue some of them. Finances, they had to combine things, and the sites eventually get combined. Next one we talk about is called St. Paul's for the Boys. This is specifically a Roman Catholic church through Father Bornemann. It originally was called St. Paul's Catholic Sisters of Charity for Boys. And by 1915, there were 125 boys that were enrolled at that time. It was only for boys, no girls, because the girls went to many times the convents or schools that were designed in that particular mode. This was on North 9th Street address. It had gone through several enlargements over the year that by 1925, they had 75 boys, but they could no longer manage to continue it, so they moved all the children to other institutions. So this one closed up. Next one. Most of you will recognize this one as a name. Topton Orphans Home. No longer Topton Orphans Home. It's a retirement community. But in 1894, the Reading Lutheran Conference decided to explore what can be done for the children related to the Lutheran Church. So the Lutheran Church did the same as we did, opened one near Fleetwood, Topton, at the junction of the Kutztown and the East Penn Railroad. There they bought 105 acres. They eventually expanded this one much larger as they built on, as we did at Bethany, and expanded here with a one. This one you can still see from out on the road 222 going north to Allentown. You can still see it up against the mountain. Because as it expanded, it took on different sizes. This was a postcard that dates back to the time, so you can see that most of the institution had postcards to advertise what they looked like. There you can see all the kids standing out in front. They had an anniversary every year. We used to go back and forth between the two institutions to integrate and talk with each other. This is what it looks like today. By 1941, fewer and fewer orphanages or orphans were admitted, so they moved to a different trend. As they were downsizing, they began accepting older citizens to come and live in some of the selected areas. And eventually they closed up the institution as an orphanage or children's home, and it now serves as a senior resident place. More than 1,600 Berks County orphans were served by Topton Home before it closed. St. Michael's is the next one that we have. Began as a seminary for young ladies. It's a 50-acre hilltop tract. Once again, it looks like a hotel because that's really how a lot of these got started. They bought up large structures that could house a lot of people. Father George Bornemann was present at the dedication of this one in 1895. This was the home of a wealthy Reading shoe manufacturer. His name was Henry Felix, if you want to go back in time. It was called Hyde Park at that time. The Immaculate Heart of the Sisters abandoned this mission after 13 years. In the archives that they have, the last graduation of the group was in 1908. You don't know exactly why they left or closed up. It's just that it did. And there are pictures that we have. That serves as a reminder to me too. These are some other pictures of the St. Michael's, and this is Father Gorneman. So if you see the picture of him and you see him around, this is the standard picture that's used to show him in any of the books or information that you have. One of the last ones that we come up to is called St. Bernardine's. This was a convent and an orphanage for the Bernardine sisters, and it ends up being at Alvernia College. So if you're anywhere near that one, this is where it comes from. It wasn't, the orphanage that was there was called St. Francis, but we'll come to that in time because we had to build this one up over a period of time. They bought property from Alvernia over on Route 10 on the south side of Reading. The four Bernardine sisters came from Poland in 1894, and this is how they got started at this place. It was a place called Millmont, is where they started their orphanage. And here is a blend of the university and the college. St. Francis developed out of this place that the Bernardine sisters had, but it did close here very, very early on in 1958 when Alvernia College started coming up. The transactions that were had here, Father Borneman was very instrumental in buying addition property, which eventually all of it turned out to be Alvernia College. Some of it was donated over a period of time by people coming through. The new convent and orphanage would house over 45 sisters and serve over 40 orphans. They ranged from 2 to 14. You can find information. They have a small archive of information on what it was like back then. But the only remnants are when you go into the student building at Alvernia. That's where the orphanage used to stand. It was enlarged in 1912, and when Mother Veronica passed away in 1916, things started to deteriorate, and they started moving through other movements to other places in the States. So from its humble beginnings in Reading, it moved to this larger one. The sisters now work in 15 different states, having similar things like this. The orphanage wasn't established until about 1926. So you can see that's a much later era from when any of the others came in. At one point it served 94 children, and eventually they had to close it due to the time frame. Some more pictures. You can see it from over time. The overhead views are spectacular. Aren't these drones wonderful? You can take pictures down on top of things so that you can watch and see what's going on. Otherwise, you have to rely on the flat pictures of just looking in on what they have them. Now, some newly found items that I came up with. If you know of any that I haven't spoken about, come back. I've been approached, would I consider putting this one in a booklet form? Yes, I'll consider that one, so that you'd have a single source that you could go and look and go backwards. You have to refine a couple of resources where we got the information to make sure that we could put it in booklet form. I'm sorry, I forget to go between the two of these. One of the newer ones that we came up to was a lady by the name of Beulah Anchorage. This is in 1907. and it was called A Home for Fallen Girls. Do you understand the terminology? I mean, we have to keep going back in history in order to understand. Girls who gave birth to a child out of wedlock were considered fallen girls because it wasn't approved by the church. The marriage was consummated without church or a wedding, and therefore they were considered fallen girls. And it took many years for people to get over this and to move on with what life was really like. This was created, as I say, in 1907. It was located at 417 South 5th Street. And there are 23 other sites that are like this one throughout America. In other words, she started it here and left. We don't know exactly what happened to it. There are very few pictures, and if we can find some, that's what we need to explore a little bit further. Another one that I found by browsing all of George Miser's books, all of them, is this one, and I will give specific reference here to George's idea. Here's a picture of an orphan's home in 1929. We don't know very much about this one, other than what is stated here. But it's a little more modern than what we can get used to and that we can see over the time. Now we have to get into some serious stuff for a few minutes. There were major changes in legislation in the 1974. The federal legislation started it all. Federal government would give money to the states to do something for the care of children. They called it the welfare department. And everything done under the welfare department needed their approval. So we're back that the children were now wards of the state. By legislation, the state decided that they did not want institutions. So Reverend Adams and Reverend Henning, that were Bethany, over 2 terms, fought the state tooth and nails over deinstitutionalizing, saying that there are some cases that you need an institution to care for some of these kids. You just can't do it one-on-one. It just cannot be done this way. So you have groups that are even like out on the mountain in Warnersville that specifically deal with drug and alcohol addiction. What's the name there? Oh, Warnersville, what's? Yes, okay. And that's another institution, but it cares for a specific need. All of the people that we have today and the institutions that we have serve a desired population. But this fight over foster care and adoption are one of the things that brought about most of the major changes that we have. So the rules today are that you have to know about foster care and adoption. Some foster care can be good, but in most cases, it's a money-making thing. People often accept children, foster children, just to get the money. Not universal, but we need to address the issue. So until we can correct the problem, it leaves a stain as to what it was. The same as there were stains from the institutions that we have also. Adoptions also are very, very difficult to deal with. I can remember a friend of mine from Bethany. He was out for adoption to 4 different families, and he kept coming back, and he says, "Why are you coming back?" And I'll be very frank with you. His answer was, they offered me the world except the one thing that I needed the most, and that was LOVE. He did sense that this was being done out of love. He sensed that they wanted to care for him, but the care was misdirected in how they had it. I think about this a lot, because even when I was younger, I was offered for adoption, but my mother would not let me be separated from my brother. Therefore, you take both of us or none of us. And we stayed together, even though it was difficult at times, but understanding that I had an option for adoption at one time. I don't know how it is, how it will be worked at that time. Today, we have different ways of dealing with similar institutions. Changes bring about the agencies that help us. There are daycares, there are preschool, there are childcare. These are not permanent. They're permanent locations in that they're just like kindergartens if you want. We had our own kindergarten at Bethany, but this is like a kindergarten before you get into school, because parents have to work. Who takes care of the kids if nobody's at home? The Olivet Boys and Girls Club and their satellites take care of children. They're mostly after hours and on weekends and things. You have a Brexit Academy in Morgantown, which is a detention center. What do you do with the children who get in trouble with the law today? You send them to jail? What do you do with them? A detention center is supposed to be a halfway house to try to deal with those people in trouble with the law, both boys and girls. Both boys and girls. The detention centers, they wanted to start closing up. So what do you do when a 14-year-old or younger kills someone else? You have to deal with the situation. So this detention center is a bridge to going to jail. We have YMCAs and YWCAs. Most of us grew up knowing these facilities. They're not quite the same. I worked for a YMCA at one time. They were boarding out people at that particular time that we had. And there are other numerous child welfare agencies. I don't want to lose any of them that contribute to the health of a child that's in need. Therefore, we have to look at all the different possibilities that we have. What kind of questions might you have? Go ahead, sir.
I was curious, the boys' home, that 1929 date, was that the date it opened or the date of the photo?
I don't know much about it. We can get back into the George's book to find what that was, to tell you exactly what it was. There's not much information because I don't even know how long it stayed open. I couldn't find any references in any other places. I searched the newspapers, just couldn't find that information one way or the other.
I just found that you're interesting because that was the year you generally say the Depression began. You might have had a lot of abandoned children to deal with in that time frame.
Yes? No? No. Yes?
The house good shepherd, was that for boys and girls or only girls?
I'm sorry, I have a hard time.
The house of good shepherd, for girls or boys and girls?
The House of Good Shepherd. I think it was for girls.
Yeah.
Most of the only Roman Church institution that took care of boys alone was the St. Paul's. All of the others were for girls. Although some of them get started having both boys and girls. I mean, when you're inviting families, you take both of the kids when they're very, very young. And you take care of the very, very young. And then oftentimes they get split up into different other locations.
Also, boys' home on Schuylkill Avenue.
Oh, yeah.
That was still in operation in the 50s, but I don't know when it started. But that was there for many years.
Okay, we'll have to look that one up then.
1960.
Yes, in the back row, there's like a...
Did your mom come and visit you whenever she wanted, or was it normally once a year, like you said?
Yes, she came often unannounced. Oftentimes, if she could get a ride, a lot of uncles brought her. I have a story that I've told Jennifer about one of my experiences. I was considered incorrigible. My incorrigibleness surfaced one time under, my mother showed up and I was in a locked closet when she got there.